Mexico and Japan. Two very different countries with two very distinct cultures, both of which have come together to make me. This video is about what my experience has been like as someone who is half Mexican and half Japanese, and born and raised in the US. First, I should say that growing up as a kid, I always felt a lot closer to my Japanese heritage than my Mexican heritage. This was mostly due to the fact that I was, in large part, raised by my grandparents on my mother's side. On the other hand, I never knew my paternal grandmother since she passed away before I was born. I did know my grandfather until he passed away when I was about 7, but he didn't speak much English and I didn't know Spanish, and so there was always a language barrier there. Why didn't I learn Spanish? Well, because unlike a lot of my other Hispanic friends, my family is very Americanized. Only my father and one of my aunts speaks any Spanish, though I doubt that they could pass for native speakers, and neither of them ended up passing the language down to their kids. On my mom's side, my grandfather knows some phrases in Japanese, but that's about it. In terms of customs and culture, there isn't a strong presence of Japan or Mexico in my family, though we did at least grow up being accustomed to some of the food. So as a kid, I think I identified mostly as American with a Japanese and Mexican flavor, if you will. But even as an American kid growing up in a suburb of Southern California, knowing that those two flavors are nevertheless a part of me has contributed towards a very subtle yet internal struggle with my identity. You see, there's a pretty stark contrast between these two cultures. On one hand, you have the Japanese culture, which in my mind is represented by respect, peacefulness, cleanliness, minimalism, and a strong sensitivity towards how one's behavior might affect others. Conversations with the Japanese side of my family are softer and more reserved. People tend to be more careful about speaking their mind. I've always felt that my personality more immediately aligns with these ideas. Since I'm a pretty reserved person, I care a lot about humility. I prefer to own fewer, more meaningful or useful things, and I sometimes care too much about how I might be perceived by others. I feel like my default state of being is just a little bit more Japanese. On the other hand, Mexican culture, to me, tends to be loud, vibrant, musical, and colorful. There's this spice or kick to it. Sitting at the dinner table with the Mexican side of my family means that people talk louder. They talk over each other instead of one by one, they laugh harder, and they open up quicker. When I entered into my college years, I somehow found myself wanting to adopt more of those characteristics into my personality. But I always struggled because I felt that that reserved, quiet nature that I mentioned earlier was already so deeply ingrained into me. To compensate, I became interested in things like public speaking, to get used to drawing attention to myself and speaking up, salsa dancing to be more in tune with moving my body and embracing a faster rhythm in life, and traveling to Mexico, since it's close to the US, and doing so helped to surround me with the culture. Another way in which I tried to get closer to both sides of my heritage, and in which there is another interesting contrast in my personal experience, is through language. So like I mentioned earlier, no one in my family really speaks either language very much, if at all. And this was a major reason why the cultural sides of me felt a bit diluted. And it seemed like that would only continue to happen through the generations unless I did something about it. So when I started high school, I signed up for Japanese class. Between high school and college, I took a total of 6 years worth of classes. It was great because it really took me deeper into the Japanese culture. The language itself, with its emphasis on expressing politeness, the methodical elegance of the brushstrokes that make up its system of writing, and even things like the bowing and two-handed presentation of things like gifts or business cards that accompany the spoken language, instills a lot of Japanese values into those that choose to learn it. Now, unfortunately, the teacher I had during high school was honestly not the best, and almost all of my learning was very textbook oriented. I did okay in classes, but sadly, after all of that time in school, to this day, I can't do more than piece together a very simple sentence. For all practical purposes, I can't really say that I know how to speak Japanese at all, and I would be lost if I traveled back to Japan. Now, in contrast, I took 1 semester of Spanish 1 in community college, and this gave me just enough of a foundation for it to be practical. Now, during this time, I was working at an electronics store, and since there are a lot of Mexican people living in Southern California, there were a lot of times when someone would need help but they could only speak Spanish. Since I couldn't always find a Spanish-speaking coworker that could come and translate for me, I slowly learned how to talk about things like cameras, memory cards, and extended warranties in Spanish. But because of these real-world scenarios and the increased interest that I had in Mexican culture during my college years, I actually ended up knowing way more Spanish than Japanese, even though I sat in a Spanish classroom for far less time. Speaking of languages, my decades-long struggle to devote the time and energy into teaching myself how to speak either one of them was motivated by something that I think can often be a defining characteristic of being multiracial, and that is that it can be tough to feel like you fit in with any one group. So as a kid, although I certainly felt American, I also felt distinctly different from what might be considered a stereotypical American. Compared to this image, I felt particularly ethnic. But despite that, I also didn't feel particularly Japanese or particularly Mexican. I think I started to become more aware of this as I grew up and noticed how some of the Japanese or Mexican kids around me had very different life experiences than I did. For instance, I remember when Pokemon was a new thing in the US, and I would force myself to wake up before 7 in the morning to watch it on TV. Now, no one knew about Pokemon cards yet, but there were a couple of Japanese boys in my 4th grade classroom that had the coolest Pokemon cards and stickers, all written in Japanese. I remember making friends with them, but having this strange feeling of being connected since we were both Japanese, and yet feeling so ignorant of this culture that I was supposed to be a part of. They spoke fluent Japanese to their parents. They invited other Japanese-speaking kids to their birthday parties. Their homes had a distinctly different feel to them, and their mannerisms were different than mine. Now, as Japanese Americans, we often use terms like sansei or yonsei, which communicates to others how many generations your family is removed from Japan. I felt a very sharp divide between myself and these kids who seemed to be somehow more authentically Japanese on the other. Later in high school, I remember having a girlfriend who had very similar feelings as I did and said that she once had a Japanese person tell her that she wasn't a true Japanese because she didn't know how to speak the language. Now, fast forward to college, we had a group of student-run organizations that centered around their respective majors and helped students network in their chosen fields. There was a marketing organization for marketing majors, a finance organization for finance majors, and I was a part of the International Business Association for all the international business majors. But it was known that some of the best parties were thrown by the Hispanic Students Business Association. For me, there was always this immediate pull or interest in getting to know that group, but still always feeling a bit like an outsider. Now, I could tell people that I was half Mexican, but I was kind of envious of how quickly they could use an expression in Spanish and then straight away continue speaking in English. How so many of them seemed to know how to dance to particular styles of music or sing to Spanish songs that were starting to make their way into the US. In fact, it sometimes kind of felt like it would just be easier if I wasn't Mexican at all. At least then there would be no expectations of me. But when I would tell people that I was Mexican, but that I didn't know the language and I didn't understand the cultural references that they were making, it always just seemed like there was a little bit of disappointment or disregard in their response. I don't know, maybe it was just my imagination. But here's where I think I finally started to grow and mature out of this. After college, I started traveling a lot more, particularly by myself. I discovered hostels and what a cultural melting pot they could be. I would be sitting at a table with other travelers, sharing a meal, and it would just be so impressive how seemingly all of them could speak 2, 3, sometimes even 4 languages. Someone would be speaking French to one person, they would translate that to me in English, and then they would turn around and start speaking German to someone else. I felt so lame being the only one at the table that could only speak one language. I hated that feeling that everyone always had to cater to me. I didn't want to be that stereotypical, arrogant American that expects everyone around them to speak English, even though they're in a foreign country. This feeling was particularly strong when I would travel to places like Spain or Mexico. Sure, I was trying to learn Spanish, but every time that I thought that I was improving, I would try to have a conversation with someone on the street and realize that I could barely understand a single word that they said. In fact, I started to grow resentful of the fact that my father never taught me how to speak the language. It just felt like it would have made life so much easier, and plus he already knew how to speak it. It could make things like college applications, job prospects, and travel experiences so much better. And learning a new language as a kid almost seems effortless right? Like, I don't remember struggling to learn how to speak English. It was just programmed into my brain. Sure, I took classes in school to get some of the technical stuff down, but try learning a new language and then listening to how a 3-year-old that grew up with that language is already way better than you are.
Estoy presentando acerca del caos en el cuerpo humano. El caos es una forma particular de decirle al orden que la humanidad no podía entender.
It's really deflating. But fortunately, at some point, I finally started to let go of that resentment and honestly, that sense of entitlement. Sitting around those hostel tables, I began to focus more on the gratitude of having the luxury of being brought up with what is perhaps the closest thing that we have to a universal language, English. At least I didn't have to try so hard to learn that. And even though I'm not fluent in another language yet, I do know that I'm not someone who will ever just rest on the idea of speaking English everywhere I go and just expect everyone else to cater to them. I will always try to learn at least a little bit of the local language when I travel abroad. People light up when they know you're trying to respect their language. And lastly, having this cultural mix, this kind of internal struggle with my identity, and a basic awareness of two very different ways of life has become a part of my personality. Because of this contrast that I have, I think that I'm someone who tries to understand both sides of an issue, who's willing to try new things in new places with new people, who cares deeply about being open-minded, and who might not fit in perfectly with any one cultural group, but who's gotten pretty good at finding ways to adapt to and appreciate the little things about everyone. Most importantly, I think having this multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial element of who I am has kind of helped to keep me from getting stuck in this trap of viewing the world and all its issues through the very limiting lens of only black or white. And instead, it's encouraged me to open my eyes to all of the beautiful ways of life that exist in between.